The morning sun cut through the high, rectangular windows of the school atrium, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished floor. It was a Tuesday, which meant the air inside the large hall smelled faintly of floor wax and the cinnamon sugar from the breakfast stand near the gym. Students were moving in clusters, their voices bouncing off the walls, creating a steady hum of noise that filled every empty space. Tom stood near the edge of the low stage, feeling completely out of place. He was 18 years old, but in this crowd of loud, confident teenagers, he felt about 6 years old. He kept his head down, staring at a loose thread hanging from his sneaker. His clothes were clean, that much he made sure of, but they were simple. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark blue jeans that had faded at the knees. They weren't the expensive brand names everyone else seemed to be wearing. Compared to the colorful sneakers and stylish jackets surrounding him, Tom felt invisible, which is exactly how he liked it most days. He clutched a black folder against his chest. It was a simple thing, just a vinyl folder with a zipper that stuck a little bit when you tried to close it, but to Tom, it felt like he was holding a bar of gold. Inside the folder were sheets of music paper, worn soft at the edges from being turned over and over again. This folder was the reason he was standing here instead of in the library, where he usually spent his mornings. Today was the day of the final auditions for the regional showcase. It was a big deal. The best acts from the school would get to go perform at the City Theater, a place with velvet seats and bright spotlights. Usually, the stage was reserved for the cheerleaders, the jazz band, or the kids who took professional voice lessons. Tom was none of those things. He was just the quiet kid who sat in the back of math class and helped his dad fix cars on the weekend. Looking at his hands, he felt a sudden wave of nerves. They were rough. The skin on his palms was thick and calloused, the result of gripping wrenches and handling hot engine parts for as long as he could remember. His knuckles were scraped, a souvenir from a transmission job he had helped with yesterday afternoon. He rubbed his thumb over the back of his other hand, trying to smooth out the dried grease that seemed to be permanently stained into his skin. No matter how much soap he used, his hands always looked like they had been working. They looked like the hands of a worker, not an artist. "Are you nervous?" a voice asked. Tom jumped slightly. He looked up to see a girl named Lisa standing there. She was holding a violin case. Lisa was the kind of student who belonged on stage. Her hair was perfectly braided, and she stood with the kind of posture that made her look taller than she actually was. Tom knew her by sight, mostly because she was always first chair in the orchestra. A little, Tom mumbled, looking back down at his sneakers. "I'm sure you'll be great," Lisa said, trying to be kind. "What are you performing?" "Piano," Tom whispered. Lisa blinked, clearly surprised. She looked down at his hands, which he quickly hid behind the folder. "Oh," she said softly. "I didn't know you played." That's really cool." Tom just nodded. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to tell her that he didn't own a real piano, that he practiced on a digital keyboard his aunt had given them, one that sometimes stuck if you pressed the keys too hard. He didn't want to tell her that he taught himself by watching videos online late at night because his family couldn't afford lessons. The noise in the atrium suddenly shifted. The conversations died down a bit, replaced by the squeak of dress shoes on the tile floor. Mr. Henderson, the principal, was walking in. He was a tall man who always wore a suit that looked a little too stiff, as if it were made of cardboard rather than fabric. He walked with a clipboard in one hand, walking with a fast, rhythmic pace that made it seem like he was always late for something very important. Tom's stomach did a flip. He swallowed hard. He had signed up for the audition 2 weeks ago, putting his name on a crumpled piece of paper in the office. He hadn't told anyone about it. Not his parents, not his friends, and certainly not the principal. Part of him hoped they would lose the paper. Part of him hoped he would just wake up and realize it was all a dream. He watched Mr. Henderson step up onto the low platform. The principal tapped the microphone once, sending a sharp thump through the speakers that made everyone wince. "All right, settle down, everyone," Mr. Henderson's voice boomed, echoing slightly. He didn't need the microphone, his voice was naturally loud, the kind of voice that commanded attention without trying. "We are here for the final selections for the showcase. I want this to be quick. I have a meeting at 10. Tom watched him check his list. The principal looked impressive up there, confident and in charge. Tom felt small in comparison. He thought about his dad, covered in grease under a car, and then about Mr. Henderson in his crisp suit. They lived in two different worlds. Tom was trying to step out of his world and into this one, but his legs felt like lead. He looked around the room. There were a few other students waiting to audition. A guy with a guitar was tuning it by the wall. A group of girls were practicing a dance routine in the corner. They all looked the part. They looked like performers. Tom looked like he had just taken a break from changing an oil filter to come stand in a hallway. He gripped the folder tighter. The music inside was the only thing that made sense to him. When he played, he didn't have to worry about being the quiet kid or the poor kid. The notes didn't care who his parents were or what his hands looked like. The music was just math and emotion, two things he understood perfectly. But standing here, waiting to be judged, he felt exposed. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and everyone was waiting to see if he would fall. Mr. Henderson looked up from his clipboard and scanned the crowd. "Let's get started," he said. "First up, let's see." Tom held his breath. He wasn't ready. He wanted to run out the side exit and just go to the auto shop. He knew exactly which car was on the lift today. He knew the muffler was loose. He knew how to fix it. He didn't know if he could handle the look in Mr. Henderson's eyes if he messed up a chord. The principal looked down at his paper again, squinting slightly at the messy handwriting. The entire atrium went quiet. Hundreds of students were watching, waiting for the show to start. Tom felt the sweat on his back, cold and uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The rubber sole of his sneaker squeaked against the floor, sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Mr. Henderson frowned. He tapped his pen against the clipboard, a sound that seemed to slow down time. Then, the principal looked up, his eyes searching the faces in the front row until they locked onto Tom. "You," Mr. Henderson said, pointing the end of his pen toward him. "I have a name here I don't recognize." "Is this a joke?" The sharp point of the pen aimed directly at him felt worse than a physical shove. Every pair of eyes in the atrium shifted, swiveling like a synchronized machine until all of them were fixed on Tom. The air in the room seemed to vanish instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating pressure. Tom froze. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, so hard that he was surprised the sound didn't echo through the sudden silence. Mr. Henderson stepped to the edge of the low stage, looking down over his glasses. The principal didn't look angry, he looked confused, as if he had found a tool in a box of cereal. He looked back at his clipboard, then up at Tom again, tilting his head to the side. "Is this a joke?" Mr. Henderson asked again, his voice booming and bouncing off the walls. "Someone put Tom on the list for piano solo. I assumed it was a mistake." I thought maybe a teacher meant to write down Thomas from the orchestra, but no, it says just Tom. Tom stood rooted to the spot. His mouth felt like it was full of cotton. He wanted to speak, to say no, sir, I signed up, but the words died in his throat. He just nodded, a small, jerky movement that made his neck hurt. You Mr. Henderson let out a short, loud laugh that sounded more like a bark. He turned to the crowd, holding up the clipboard as if sharing a funny cartoon. Look, everyone. We have a mystery performer. Tom wants to play the piano for us. A few nervous giggles rippled through the students. It wasn't that they hated Tom, most of them didn't even know who he was. They laughed because the principal was laughing. It was the safest thing to do. Come on up here, Tom, Mr. Henderson said, waving his hand in a circular motion. Let's have a look at you. Tom forced his legs to move. It felt like walking through deep water. He climbed the 2 steps onto the stage platform. The lights were brighter up here, making him squint. He stood a few feet away from the principal. Up close, Mr. Henderson looked enormous. He smelled like expensive cologne and fresh paper. The principal looked Tom up and down, his eyes scanning the faded jeans and the plain gray t-shirt. He lingered on Tom's arms, which were tense at his sides. Then, without asking, Mr. Henderson reached out and grabbed Tom's right hand. The principal turned Tom's hand over, palm up, for everyone to see. The fluorescent lights overhead glinted off the calluses, the thick pads of skin built up over years of gripping tools. There was a small, healing scrape on his knuckle, and a faint smudge of oil near the wrist that Tom had missed in the bathroom sink. Look at this, Mr. Henderson said to the audience, dropping Tom's hand back down. These aren't the hands of a pianist. These are the hands of a mechanic. Or a construction worker. He looked at Tom with a smirk. No offense, son, but we are selecting for the regional showcase. This is a prestigious event. We need polish. We need refinement. We need artists. He said the word artists like it was a rare gem, glancing at Lisa with the violin and the boy with the guitar. They looked polished. Their hands were soft, their clothes clean and bright. Tom looked like he belonged in a garage with a wrench in his hand. I fix cars, sir, Tom managed to say. His voice sounded thin and pathetic in the large room. Exactly. Mr. Henderson spread his arms wide. He fixes cars. Which is a noble trade, don't get me wrong. We need people to keep our engines running. He chuckled again, shaking his head. But this stage is for music. Not for grease. The laughter from the students grew louder. It wasn't nervous anymore. It was the laughter of kids who felt safe because someone else was the target. Someone whispered "grease monkey" from the back row. Another person made a honking noise. Tom felt his face burn hotter. He could feel the heat rising up his neck, burning his ears. He felt small and dirty and incredibly stupid for thinking he could ever be part of this world. He gripped his black folder tighter, bending the cardboard backing. He wanted to run. He wanted to jump off the stage, push through the crowd, and just keep running until he reached the auto shop. The shop smelled like oil and old rubber, but at least nobody there laughed at him. Mr. Henderson checked his watch. All right, let's not waste any more time. Tom, it was brave of you to sign up. Or maybe it was just a prank. He looked around for the culprit. Whoever put him up to this, funny haha. Now, get back to class, Tom. You're holding up the line. The principal turned his back on Tom, dismissively flipping a page on his clipboard. Next, we have Lisa, with the violin. Lisa stepped forward, looking sympathetic but also relieved that it wasn't her being teased. She gave Tom a tiny, awkward smile as she walked past him to the center of the stage. Tom stood there for a second. He looked at the back of Mr. Henderson's head. He looked at the hundreds of faces staring at him, waiting for him to scurry away in shame. He thought about the keyboard sitting in his living room. He thought about the nights he spent practicing until his fingers cramped, learning to press the keys gently despite his strength, learning to be soft when his whole life had been hard. He didn't move. Mr. Henderson realized the music hadn't started. He turned around, frowning. "I said you can go, Tom. The audition is over for you." Tom took a deep breath. He was terrified. His knees were shaking so badly he thought they might buckle. But a strange feeling was rising in his chest. It was anger, but it was calm. It was the feeling of being backed into a corner with no way out but forward. "I didn't come here to quit," Tom said. The words were quiet, but in the silence of the room, they were heard. Mr. Henderson blinked, surprised that the quiet boy was still there. "Excuse me. I signed the paper," Tom said, a little louder this time. His voice didn't shake as much as he thought it would. "The rules say if you sign up, you get 2 minutes. I'm here for my 2 minutes." The principal let out a sigh of annoyance, throwing his hands up. "This is ridiculous. You are going to embarrass yourself, son. Look at you. You're not a performer." "I didn't say I was a performer," Tom said, looking past the principal to the sleek grand piano sitting in the corner of the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny, with a lid that reflected the ceiling lights. "I said I play piano." "And I said," Mr. Henderson stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate him, "that you are wasting our time. Those hands of yours are going to ruin the melody. You have no rhythm, you have no training. You're just a kid with a wrench and a dream." The crowd oahed. It was a harsh thing to say to a student. Tom didn't look at the principal anymore. He just looked at the piano. He remembered what his father had told him once when they were fixing a transmission that everyone else said was beyond repair. "Don't let them tell you what you can't do just because of what you look like. Let the work speak for itself." Tom took a step past the principal. "Stop," Mr. Henderson ordered. Tom didn't stop. He walked to the piano bench. He could hear the principal shifting his weight behind him, hear the whispering of the students, hear the sounds of a school laughing at him. He sat down on the bench. It was firm and upholstered in black leather. Before he touched the keys, Tom did something that made the room go quiet. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a clean, white rag. He set his folder on the music rack, then, he began to wipe his hands. He wasn't cleaning them just to be polite. He was focusing. He was wiping away the doubt, the fear, and the grease of the morning. He rubbed his fingertips, one by one, until they felt dry and clean. Mr. Henderson was standing a few feet away, his face red. "Fine," the principal snapped. "If you insist on making a fool of yourself, go ahead. But don't blame me when you hit the wrong notes." Tom placed the rag on the bench beside him. He looked at the keys. They were white and black, pristine, and waiting. He took a slow breath in, filling his lungs, and then let it out. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the laughing students or the angry principal. He closed his eyes for a second, hearing the music in his head, the song he had played 1,000 times in the dark. He opened his eyes, placed his rough, calloused hands over the keys, and pressed down. The very first sound that came out of the instrument was not what anyone expected. It wasn't a clumsy plink or a hesitant test note. It was a deep, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the students standing in the front row. It was a sound that demanded attention, a low growl that cut through the giggles and whispers like a knife through hot butter. Mr. Henderson, who had been turning to walk back to his chair, froze mid-step. He turned his head slowly, looking over his shoulder. The annoyance on his face was replaced by a momentary look of confusion. The chord hung in the air, rich and complex, vibrating against the high ceiling. Tom didn't move. His hands were hovering over the keys, fingers curved like claws. For a second, he just let the sound fade away naturally until the room was completely silent again. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't an empty silence, it was a heavy, waiting silence. Then, his right hand moved. It started fast. A cascade of notes rippled down the keyboard, a waterfall of sound that was incredibly precise. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for the right keys. His fingers, the ones Mr. Henderson had mocked just moments ago, were moving with a blur of speed. It was a chaotic, rushing sound, like a sudden storm. The students who had been laughing a minute ago were now craning their necks, trying to see if this was actually the same boy who fixed cars in the auto shop. Lisa, who was holding her violin case, took a step closer to the edge of the stage. Her eyes were wide. She knew music. She knew how hard it was to play that fast and hit every single note cleanly. She watched Tom's hands. They didn't look like a mechanic's hands anymore. They looked powerful. The music shifted suddenly. The chaotic rushing smoothed out into a melody that was haunting and sad. Tom's left hand began to play a steady, rhythmic bass line while his right hand wove a tune that tugged at the heart. He leaned into the piano, his eyes closing. He wasn't reading the music on the rack anymore. He didn't need to. The notes were inside him. The contrast was shocking to watch. Here was this boy in faded jeans and work boots, hunched over a grand piano that cost more than his family probably made in a year. He was playing with an intensity that made his muscles bunch up under his t-shirt. You could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as he poured himself into the performance. He wasn't just pressing keys, he was attacking them, then caressing them. He knew exactly how much weight to put behind each finger. The years of gripping wrenches had given him a strength in his fingers that most classical players didn't have. When he wanted a note to be loud, it rang out like a bell. When he wanted it to be soft, it was like a whisper. Mr. Henderson walked back to the center of the stage. He didn't look annoyed anymore. He looked stunned. He stood near the piano, watching Tom's hands fly across the ivory. He looked at the rough skin on Tom's knuckles as they flexed and stretched. It didn't make sense to him. He had spent his life judging people based on their appearances, on their clothes, on their backgrounds. He had decided in 2 seconds that Tom wasn't good enough. Now, the evidence was blaring in his ears, loud and clear. The music grew louder. It was filling the entire atrium. The sound bounced off the lockers in the hallway and seemed to shake the glass of the windows. It was a demanding, aggressive piece of music, full of jumps and complicated rhythms. At one point, Tom's hands crossed over each other, leaping up and down the keyboard. He missed a note, a tiny, sharp sound that rang out wrong. A few people in the crowd winced, expecting Mr. Henderson to stop him, to point out the mistake and say, "I told you so." But Tom didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. He just kept going, flowing right past the mistake as if it had never happened. That was the difference between practicing in a bedroom and performing in front of people. He wasn't scared of the mistake, he was focused on the music. The tension in Tom's face relaxed slightly. He wasn't thinking about the principal anymore. He wasn't thinking about the greasy shop or the math class he was missing. He was thinking about the feeling of the music. It was an escape. For 3 minutes, he wasn't the quiet kid with the weird hands. He was a conductor of emotions. He was in control. The melody changed again, becoming softer, more delicate. The heavy stomping of the left hand stopped, and the music became light and airy. Tom's touch became incredibly gentle. You could see him barely grazing the keys, coaxing the sound out of the piano rather than forcing it. The contrast between the loud, powerful sections and this new softness was breathtaking. In the audience, a girl who had been scrolling through her phone put it away in her pocket. A group of boys by the vending machine stopped talking to listen. Even the teachers standing by the doors stopped their whispering. The room was being pulled in by the sound. It was like a story was being told without words, a story of struggle and then peace, of hard work and then release. Tom's fingers were starting to hurt. He was playing a piece that demanded a lot of stamina, and he was putting everything he had into it. He could feel the burn in his forearms, but he didn't slow down. He used the pain to fuel the music. He thought about his father coming home tired, about the long nights, about the feeling of wanting something more but not knowing how to ask for it. He put all that into the keys. The music began to build up again. It was climbing toward a climax. The notes were getting faster, the chords getting thicker. It was a wall of sound coming toward them. Tom was breathing hard now, his hair falling over his forehead. He lifted his hands high and brought them down simultaneously, crashing into a massive, dissonant chord that shook the bench. He held it. He leaned forward, putting his whole body weight into sustaining that one loud, tense sound. The room vibrated. Mr. Henderson took a step back, his eyes locked on the boy. Then, in a flash, Tom's hands released the chord and jumped up to the high end of the piano. He played a rapid, descending run of notes that sparkled like water tumbling over rocks. The tension broke. The music relaxed. He was bringing it home. He wasn't showing off anymore. He was just playing. He was a kid who loved an instrument, sharing something he loved. The roughness of his hands didn't matter. The grease under his nails didn't matter. The music was pure. As he approached the final few bars, the tempo slowed down. The notes became wider, more spacious. He played 3 deep, resonant chords that marked the end of the phrase. The sound echoed beautifully, hanging in the air like a fog. Tom lifted his hands off the keys, but he didn't move. He sat there, staring at the sheet music, waiting for the very last vibration of the strings to stop completely. The atrium was dead silent. Not a single person moved. Not a single cough or whisper. It was as if everyone had collectively stopped breathing. The silence was heavy, filled with the ghost of the music they had just heard. Mr. Henderson stood there, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the piano, then at Tom, then back at the piano. He looked like a man who had just seen a dog solve a math equation. He couldn't process it. The boy in the greasy jeans had just played better than half the students in his honors band. Tom sat on the bench, his chest rising and falling. His hands were resting on his thighs. He slowly opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd. For a second, he looked terrified again, wondering if they had hated it. But then he saw their faces. They weren't laughing. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't the awkward, heavy silence of before. It was a shocked stillness, the kind that happens when people witness something that doesn't fit into their understanding of the world. The last echo of the piano note had faded completely, yet the air in the room still seemed to be vibrating. Tom sat on the bench, his hands resting on his denim-clad legs. He was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling with the effort of the performance. His heart was pounding so loudly he was sure the microphone nearby would pick it up. He kept his eyes down, staring at the black and white keys, afraid to look up. He felt exposed, like he had taken off his skin and shown everyone the raw, red muscle underneath. Then, a sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a shout or a laugh. It was the sharp, distinct sound of a single pair of hands clapping. Clap. 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 Tom's head snapped up. Standing in the front row, near the edge of the stage, was Lisa, the violinist. She wasn't smiling or looking around to see if anyone else was joining in. She was looking right at Tom, her expression serious and respectful. She clapped with a steady rhythm, her hands meeting firmly. For a moment, she was the only one making noise. It felt like a long time, though it was only a few seconds. Then, the boy with the guitar raised his hand and started clapping too. A teacher near the back joined in. Suddenly, the dam broke. The applause didn't just trickle in, it exploded. It started as a wave of noise from the front and rolled toward the back of the atrium like thunder. Students were on their feet. Some were cheering, others were whistling. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the walls and ceiling, filling the huge space with a roar of approval that seemed to shake the floorboards. Tom sat there, frozen. He blinked rapidly, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked out at the sea of faces. The same kids who had been giggling and whispering "Grease Monkey" just minutes ago were now smiling and clapping for him. Their faces weren't mocking anymore, they were filled with genuine surprise and excitement. He saw a group of cheerleaders looking at each other with their mouths open, pointing at him as if they couldn't believe their eyes. He saw the boys from the football team nodding their heads in respect. It was a surreal moment. The world had turned upside down in the span of 3 minutes. Mr. Henderson, the principal, stood a few feet away from the piano. He hadn't moved. His hands were hanging loosely at his sides, his clipboard forgotten. His face was pale. He looked at the cheering students, then back at Tom. He looked like a man who had just been told the earth was actually flat. His whole system of judging people based on their clothes, their hands, their background had just been shattered. He was trying to find a way to understand what had just happened, but he couldn't. The evidence was too strong. The talent was too real. The applause continued for a long time. Tom didn't know what to do. He felt a lump forming in his throat, a tightness that made it hard to swallow. He had never been the center of attention like this. He had never been the hero of the story. Slowly, awkwardly, he stood up. He almost tripped on the leg of the bench, which caused a few people to laugh kindly, not mockingly. He turned to face the crowd. He didn't bow like the fancy performers did on television. He just stood there, clutching his black folder against his chest like a shield. He gave a small, shy nod. It was a nod of thanks, a nod that said, "I hear you, and I appreciate it." When he nodded, the noise got even louder. Someone shouted, "Play another one." Another voice yelled, "That was insane." Mr. Henderson finally seemed to wake up from his daze. He cleared his throat loudly and stepped up to the microphone. He tapped it twice, but the crowd was too loud to hear him. He had to wave his hands and say, all right, settle down, please." Gradually, the students lowered their voices and took their seats. The energy in the room was still electric, buzzing like a live wire. Everyone was leaning forward, waiting to see what the principal would say. They were waiting to see if he would admit he was wrong. Mr. Henderson looked at Tom, then at the crowd. He adjusted his tie, which felt suddenly too tight. His face was flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and reluctant admiration. He didn't like being wrong, but he wasn't a stupid man. He knew when he had been beaten. "Well," Mr. Henderson said into the microphone, his voice sounding a bit strangled. "That was, certainly unexpected." A few students booed lightly at the understatement. The principal held up a hand to silence them. "I think we can all agree that I made a hasty judgment. I looked at the exterior and failed to see the capability within." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Tom, that was a remarkable performance. Your control, your power, it was exceptional." Tom stood by the piano, his face turning red. He didn't know how to handle a compliment from the man who had just humiliated him. He just mumbled, "Thank you, sir." "You have secured a spot in the showcase," Mr. Henderson continued, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "Obviously. We would be fools not to send you." This announcement was met with loud cheers and stomping feet. The students loved the underdog story. They loved seeing the quiet guy win. It was better than any movie they had watched recently. Tom felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had actually done it. He was going to the showcase. He thought about his parents. He thought about how proud his dad would be, not just because of the music, but because Tom had stood up for himself. He had proved that the work he did with his hands didn't make him less of an artist, it made him stronger. Mr. Henderson looked down at his clipboard, flipping the page aggressively, trying to regain his authority. "Now, we have a schedule to keep. Let's move on." "Lisa, are you ready?" Lisa stepped forward, but before she took her place, she walked over to Tom. She leaned in close so the microphone wouldn't pick up her voice. "You were amazing," she whispered. Her eyes were shining. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Tom shrugged, a small smile finally breaking through his nervousness. "Just at home. On an old keyboard." Lisa shook her head in awe. "You have something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She gave his arm a gentle squeeze and walked to the center of the stage to set up her music stand. Tom took that as his cue to leave. He didn't want to overstay his welcome and ruin the moment. He carefully picked up his rag from the bench and folded it, putting it back into his pocket. Then, he picked up his folder. As he walked toward the side of the stage to step down, the path was clear. No one was blocking him. No one was looking at him with judgment. As he passed the front row, students reached out to give him high fives. A guy he recognized from history class, but had never spoken to, patted him on the back. "Way to go, man," the guy said. "Seriously?" Tom nodded, unable to find his voice. He felt lightheaded, like he was walking on a cloud. He reached the stairs and walked down into the crowd. He didn't go back to his spot at the edge of the room. He walked toward the exit. He felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It wasn't anxiety. It was a warm, glowing feeling of pride. He had walked into the atrium as the mechanic's son. He was walking out as a musician. He reached the double glass doors that led to the hallway. He pushed one open, the cool air from the corridor hitting his face. He took one last look back. Mr. Henderson was watching him. The principal didn't wave or smile, but he didn't look away either. He just watched, with a look that Tom would never forget, a look of pure, undiluted respect. Tom stepped through the door and let it swing shut behind him, cutting off the sound of the violin starting to play. He leaned against the wall for a moment, letting out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. He looked down at his hands. They were still the same hands. They were still rough, still scarred, still stained with a little bit of oil. But now, when he looked at them, he didn't see workers' hands. He saw artists' hands. He saw hands that could fix an engine and touch the sky. Tom smiled, a real, genuine smile that stretched across his face. He adjusted his folder under his arm and started walking toward his class, his steps lighter and more confident than they had ever been. The hallway seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. He wasn't invisible anymore. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he never would be again. The weeks that followed that morning in the atrium passed in a blur for Tom. It felt like he was living in a different world, one where the colors were a little brighter and the air felt a little lighter to breathe. The whispers that used to follow him down the hallway had changed completely. Before, when other students looked at him, they saw a quiet kid in worn-out clothes who probably smelled like motor oil. Now, when they looked at him, they saw the piano guy. It was a strange transition for someone who had spent his entire life trying not to be seen. Now, people he had never spoken to before would stop at his locker to say hello. The football players, who used to bump into him in the corridor without apologizing, gave him respectful nods. Even the teachers treated him differently. His math teacher, Mr. Rivers, asked him about his practice routine, and the literature teacher, Mrs. Gable, suggested he might want to write about the power of music for his next essay. But the biggest change of all was at home. That evening, after the audition, Tom had sat his parents down in the small living room. He told them everything: the principal's mocking, the laughter from the crowd, and the way he had refused to leave the stage. Then, he played the piece for them on their old, slightly out of tune electric keyboard in the corner. His mother had cried, pressing a hand to her mouth, while his father sat in his recliner with his arms crossed, a look of fierce pride on his face. When Tom finished, his father didn't say much. He just stood up, walked over to Tom, and put a heavy hand on his shoulder, squeezing it hard. "That's my boy," he said gruffly. "You showed them." The night of the regional showcase arrived on a cool Friday. The City Theater was a grand, old building with velvet seats and golden trimmings that gleamed under the chandelier lights. It was a far cry from the school gym or the greasy auto shop. Backstage, the air smelled of hairspray, floor polish, and nervous sweat. Tom stood in the wings, peeking through the heavy curtains at the audience. The seats were packed. He could see rows and rows of people: parents, teachers, students from other schools, and even judges from the State Arts Committee. His stomach was doing flips, bouncing around like a rubber ball. He wiped his palms on his jeans, a nervous habit he couldn't break. He was wearing his nicest clothes, which were still just a pair of black slacks and a white button-down shirt, but he felt cleaner, more presentable. 5 minutes, piano, a stage manager whispered, walking by with a headset. Tom took a deep breath. He looked down at his hands. They were rougher than ever, thanks to a busy week at the shop helping his dad replace a transmission. He had scrubbed them thoroughly before leaving the house, but the lines of his life were still etched into his skin. For a second, the old doubt crept back in. What if the people out there saw his hands and laughed? What if they were like Mr. Henderson had been? But then he remembered the feeling in the atrium, he remembered the silence after the last note. He straightened his back. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for the grease under his nails, for the long hours, and for the love of the sound. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. And now, performing an original arrangement of Rachmaninoff, please welcome Tom from Central High. Tom walked out onto the stage. The spotlight hit him instantly, blinding him for a second. He couldn't see the audience, just a wall of darkness beyond the bright light. He walked to the grand piano sitting in the center of the stage. It was bigger than the one at school, a glossy black monster that seemed to gleam in the light. He sat down on the bench. He pulled his rag out of his pocket, not the old greasy one, but a new, soft blue cloth his mother had given him, and wiped his hands one last time. It was a ritual now. A moment to center himself. He placed his fingers on the keys. The theater was dead silent. He could hear his own heartbeat thumping in his ears. He began to play. The sound that filled the theater was immense. The acoustics were amazing, carrying every note to the back of the hall. Tom played with everything he had. He played the anger he felt when people underestimated him. He played the joy he felt when the music worked. He played the love he had for his family, who worked so hard for him. Because he knew the audience was watching, he put extra power into the difficult sections. His hands flew across the keys, a blur of motion. The contrast was striking, his weather-beaten, worker's hands dancing gracefully over the pristine ivory. It was a visual story in itself. You could see the strength in his fingers, the same strength used to tighten bolts, now used to create beauty. About halfway through the piece, Tom made a mistake. He hit a wrong chord, a jarring sound that rang out clearly in the quiet theater. His heart skipped a beat. No, he thought. Not here. But he didn't stop. He didn't panic. He just kept going, flowing into the next measure. He remembered Mr. Henderson's face that day in the atrium, the look of shock. He used that memory to push harder, to play louder, to make the music so big that the mistake disappeared. It became just a bump in the road, a small imperfection that made the rest of the performance feel human and real. As he reached the climax of the song, the music swelled. The theater seemed to vibrate. He poured his soul into the final chords, striking them with a confidence he didn't know he possessed. Then, he lifted his hands high, ending the piece with a soft, fading whisper of a note that hung in the air like magic. Tom sat there, hands hovering over the keys, breathing hard. For 3 seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, the theater erupted. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. People stood up immediately. The applause was like a physical wave hitting the stage. Tom could see shapes standing in the darkness beyond the lights. He saw a bouquet of flowers being thrown toward the stage. He heard someone whistle loudly. He stood up and turned to face the darkness. He couldn't see their faces, but he could feel them. They weren't laughing at the mechanic's son. They were cheering for the musician. He bowed deeply, awkwardly, clutching his blue rag. The applause got even louder. As he walked off the stage, his legs felt weak, like jelly. Backstage, the first person he saw was Mr. Henderson. The principal was standing by the exit, wearing a suit that looked even more expensive than usual. For a moment, Tom felt that old instinct to shrink away, to prepare for an insult. But Mr. Henderson wasn't frowning. He was looking at Tom with a look of genuine admiration. He held out his hand. "Tom, the principal said, his voice steady. That was extraordinary. You have a rare gift. Tom looked at the hand, then up at the man's face. He saw no mockery there. He saw a man who had learned a lesson. Tom reached out and shook the principal's hand. His grip was firm, his hand rough and calloused. Mr. Henderson didn't pull away. He gripped it back, firmly. Thank you, sir, Tom said. You made the school proud today, Mr. Henderson said, and he actually smiled. It was a real smile, not a smirk. I look forward to seeing what you do next. Tom walked past him, his head held high. He found his parents waiting for him near the dressing rooms. His mother was crying again, but this time they were happy tears. His father grabbed him in a bear hug, lifting him off his feet for a second. You did it, kid, his father said, his voice thick with emotion. You really did it? I told you I could fix it, Tom said, grinning. Fix it? You didn't just fix it, his father laughed, setting him down. You rebuilt the whole engine. Later that night, as Tom walked out of the theater into the cool night air, he looked up at the stars. He felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired. He looked at his hands one last time under the street lamp. The grease stains were still there, faint shadows on his skin. They would always be there. No amount of scrubbing would ever completely wash away his past. But that was okay. He realized now that he didn't need to hide where he came from to be accepted. He didn't need to pretend to be someone he wasn't. His hands were capable of two very different things: building things with steel and iron, and creating beauty with music and sound. He got into the passenger seat of his father's old truck. As they drove home, listening to the hum of the engine, Tom closed his eyes. He could still hear the applause in his mind, but more importantly, he could hear the music. And he knew that this was just the beginning. He wasn't just a mechanic, and he wasn't just a pianist. He was Tom. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.